Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to part 2 of my conversation with Mr. Sam Vaknin. Sam, thank you for joining us here today.
I used to be a doctor and a professor. Now I'm Mr. Next thing you would call me this Vaknin.
this dude Vaknin.
This dude. Welcome to my second conversation with this dude. Unmemorable dude.
My apologies, Mr. Professor Sam Vaknin.
Professor Doctor,
Sam
like
Vaknin.
in Germany.
Professor Doctor, yeah.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you. I wanted to get your take on this because I'm seeing people responding to this online. There's this proliferation. It's become a trend on TikTok of younger people, adolescents, claiming to have DID. They film themselves going through their different alters, changing states, and they allege they're showing what DID is really all about. I'm in the camp that says I really don't think that DID exists. I wanted to know what your take was on the diagnosis and what you think of this proliferation of people demonstrating that they have it. What do you think that's all about?
No, the demonstrations are nonsense. One of the main features of DID is what we call the dissociative partition. In other words, the various alters are not aware of each other, with one exception. There's one subspecies of DID, which is exceedingly rare, where the alters are aware of each other. But that's exceedingly rare, and they are aware after the fact, never before. So no one who is demonstrating online has DID, because he wouldn't know that he has DID. It's this dissociative process. In other words, the alters forget. So you have one alter out, and then he disappears, and there's another personality coming out, and that personality doesn't know that it's never been there before. It's so the change is unconscious and dissociative.
You said there's a dissociative partition for it to be DID? Yeah. There must be a dissociative partition.
With one exception. There's one very rare type of DID where the partition is partial or doesn't exist, and the alters, the various states of consciousness which masquerade as personalities, they are, in this particularly rare subvariant of DID, they are aware of each other. Okay. But in the overwhelming vast majority of DID cases, the distinguishing feature is the fact that these personalities are not aware of each other. There is a coordinating personality known as the host, and the host personality is the only one who is aware of all the other personalities. But the host personality tries to hide the existence of the other personalities. It's a protective personality and a coordinating personality. And so it tries to hide their existence because it doesn't want these personalities to communicate with each other. It wants control. It wants to control the situation. So the demonstrations are nonsense. As to the diagnosis, there are extreme post-traumatic conditions that prevent the integration and constellation of a coherent unitary self, for lack of a better word. In a minute, if you wish, we will discuss the question, is there such a thing as self?
Oh yeah, I'd like to get to that.
But metaphorically speaking, this core identity, this place where you are and always are, this place where you feel the same, you felt the same yesterday as you feel today, the place that maintains your continuity. So trauma disrupts the formation of this core. And instead what happens, you fragment, and there are fragments. Now, the extent of the fragmentation determines whether you are, for example, you have borderline personality disorder, whether you have narcissism, because narcissistic personality disorder is a fragmentation of the self. There's a false self and a true self. So clinically, narcissistic personality disorder is distinguished from DID only by the number of fragments. It's a two-fragment state. Borderline has more. DID is just an exaggeration of these conditions. Now, here's the big debate in psychology. Are we a unitary core or not? So the prevailing orthodoxy for a very long time, starting with the likes of Jung, not even Freud, by the way, but Jung invented the concept of constellated self, So the orthodoxy has been, we have this nucleus, this core, which is cohesive and coherent and congruent, omnipresent, always there, and provides the sense of continuity, of personal continuity. This was the orthodoxy. But the orthodoxy has been challenged starting in 1940, actually. There was a guy called Myers, and he studied war veterans. Myers said, when you're traumatized, even as an adult, doesn't have to be trauma in early childhood, as we used to think. But when you're traumatized, even as an adult, you break apart. And you break apart extensively. In other words, it's not a minor fracture or hairline fracture. It's you break apart, simply. So Myers coined the terms ANP and EP. So ANP is apparently normal part, and EP is emotional part, the seat of negative affectivity, fears, and so on. So he was probably the first to describe a fragmentation owing to trauma. And then there was an avalanche. There's a theory of subpersonalities. There's the internal family system. There's ego state psychology. There is ego nuclei in object theory. There is complexes in Jung, concept of complexes. There's schemas in schema theory. And the father of our new conception is a guy called Philip Bromberg. And Philip Bromberg came with the idea of self-states, which is the idea I adhere to, and the idea I have taken further and applied to cluster B. If you ask me the right questions, I'll give you the right answers later. But Philip Bromberg came with this concept of self-states. And self-states are the result of disruption of integrative processes via trauma, especially in pre-morbid personalities with proclivities to mental illness, like children who are about to become borderline. So they are called pre-morbid. So in these personalities, the fragmentation would be very, very powerful and lifelong and very strong. Now, each self-state has a sense of self and has exclusive access to some memories. So they don't share all the memories all the time. So rather than describe what other people have said, that's why I gave you the whole list. So that people can look up. They can go and look internal family system. They can go and look up sub-personalities. They can go, they can just go and look up. Rather than waste time now on reviewing the past, I would like very much to discuss my suggestions, my contributions. My contributions are gradually becoming actually mainstream. If you go to my YouTube channel, you will see a colloquium, a symposium that I gave in McGill University in Canada, where I describe my new theory, my new work. And I'm invited to Cambridge, to other universities. So it's becoming a bit mainstream. And because I believe it provides a much better description of a human being than hitherto. You see, hitherto, we considered human beings to be lakes. A lake. There were boundaries, and the lake was the self. I don't think so. I think human beings are rivers. They're rivers. They flow, and you can never step into the same river twice. I'm like Heraclitus, Pantarei, everything flows. So I believe that people are rivers, and if they're rivers, that means they're mutable. They change all the time in fundamental ways. And so the self-states model, I believe, is much better suited to describe human psychology than the core immutable self. So my first contribution was to suggest that self-state theory should not be limited to trauma or post-traumatic conditions. Because all the other work,
that was going to be one of my first questions. Is you're proposing this as the baseline
basis of
for
psychology,
humanity?
I'm proposing to get rid of the concepts of self, individual, personality. I think these concepts are exceedingly misleading. And counterfactual, not supported by studies and research. So
agreed.
And they're very antiquated concepts, and they have to do with Victorian mores of stability, and everything in the 19th century was stable and traditional and immutable, and there was the order, the empire was forever, 1,000-year Reich, everything was very stable.
Yes.
And don't forget that most of psychology was developed by Germans and Austrians.
Yeah.
Now, it's not politically correct to say. But
don't say it, Sam.
These were cultures and societies with highly specific attitude to life. And in my case, to death. So, I mean,
these are jokes only you can make, Sam.
Yeah. So people tend to ignore this crucial fact.
Yeah.
Psychology was developed in a highly idiosyncratic context.
Yes.
Socially and culturally.
Yeah.
Only then, decades later, it emigrated to the United States. Decades later. The first psychologists were Wundt, Freud, Breuer. It's all Germans, Swiss, Germans, Austrians, the German sphere of influence. So stability was crucial. Unity was crucial. Single head of state. Authority was crucial. Ask Adolf Hitler. So, and these were reflected in the so-called science, in the pseudoscience that emerged, which is called psychology. Today, I think we are a lot more sophisticated and a lot more advanced, and we should consider the concept of self, an assemblage of self-states, a repertory, a group of actors, as a much more befitting metaphor for the human existence, or the human mind, or whatever you want to call it. So my first contribution is to suggest that we have to revamp psychology, get rid of antiquated concepts like self, individual, personality, and start from scratch applying the self-states model, which is not mine, just borrowing it.
Yeah.
My second contribution was to suggest that specifically in personality disorders, and even more specifically in cluster B personality disorders, there is no type constancy. In other words, if you're a narcissist, you will have borderline moments.
Yes.
And then you will have psychopathic moments. And then you will have paranoid moments. And then you will have schizoid moments. In other words, all personality disorders are actually one. This I had suggested in 1995, not now. In the ICD, in the 11th edition of the International Classification of Diseases, which is the DSM of the rest of the world,
yep,
this is accepted, not because of me. This approach is embedded there. So they have a single personality disorder. I think that's very true. Now, the question is, how do you transition from narcissism to, for example, borderline? I postulate that you always transition from narcissist to borderline to psychopath to paranoid to schizoid, always. The transition is inevitable and an integral clinical feature of personality disorders. But the question is, what's the mechanism? How do you transition? And here I made a contribution. I said the mechanism is, first of all, I said every personality disorder has an overt version and a covert version. Every. And you transition via collapse and mortification. When your personality disorder, which started as a positive adaptation, personality disorders start because you have to adapt. You have to survive. It's a survival strategy. When it no longer works, you collapse. Your defenses are disabled, decompensation. You collapse, and then you're mortified, and then you transition to another personality disorder, or from overt to covert. So the overt narcissist will transition to covert. The cerebral narcissist will transition to somatic. And if these solutions fail, he will dysregulate and he will become borderline. That's, by the way, not me, that's Grotstein. Grotstein, who was a psychoanalyst, suggested that borderlines are failed narcissists. He said the child tries to become a narcissist, but if he fails, he remains a borderline.
Yeah.
So my contribution is the mechanism. I said every disorder has overt, covert. When you fail, when you collapse, when your disorder is not working for you, for example, when the narcissist cannot obtain supply, or when the borderline is abandoned and rejected. So the disorder is not working for you. You switch from overt to covert. If this doesn't work for you, you collapse, you're mortified, and you go to another disorder altogether. That's why the borderline, for example, has a psychopathic self-state, which I will come to a bit later. So this was my first contribution. There are 4 of them. You may wish to interrupt me.
Carry on. I'm thinking as you're talking,
how does it feel?
It's extraordinarily painful. You'll be gratified to know. Haven't been tortured psychologically like this in a long time. It explains. It feels much more coherent to me. It feels much more. I just have never really been comfortable with the idea that that's a narcissist, that's a borderline, and then you think, but that sounds great on paper, but applied to a human being, I think humans are a bit messier than that. There is going to be.
That's why we have comorbidity.
Right.
That's why we have comorbidities. That's why people are diagnosed with multiple personality disorders. which is
that the comorbidity element is that sort of that tepid compromise of the stern Austrian Unitarian saying, no, well, one thing, and you as a narcissist, but you could be comorbid for a little bit and then back to, and I'm just like that. It's never really sat well with me. This, when you said you'll be narcissist, you'll be borderline, you'll be psychopathic, then you'll go schizoid, then paranoid, and this is inevitable, I thought that makes sense. It's
inevitable because of what we call structural dissociation.
Right.
Structural dissociation simply means that when you are subject to extreme stressors, and when you're subject to trauma, you disintegrate. The integration fails. So structural dissociation teaches us that traumas reduce integrative capacity. And the mistake was to think that trauma can happen only in childhood. Traumas happen daily, small, big, very big even. When very big traumas happen, you regress, you disintegrate, and you switch. Now, here's the difference between comorbidity and my work. Comorbidity says you have 2 or more personality disorders simultaneously. This is so nonsensical that I don't know where to begin. For example, how can you be at the same time a psychopath and a borderline?
Yeah.
Borderline is about emotional dysregulation.
Yes.
Psychopath is emotionless. Yes. By definition.
Yes.
How can you be at the same time? You can't.
No, it's not.
Comorbidity is
two
nonsense.
Different containers. 2 different containers.
You can't.
Yeah.
The only explanation is that sometimes you're borderline and sometimes you're psychopath. Not that simultaneously you're borderline and psychopath. So comorbidity is a nonsense we should get rid of completely.
Yeah.
And the only way to get rid of it is to say we can all be everything, but not simultaneously. We transition. And this is the concept of self-states. We transition from one self-state, which is total. When we are in that self-state, this is our self.
Yeah.
This is the self. We then finish with it because it fails, it collapses, and we move on to another self-state. Yes, you can be borderline and psychopath, not at the same time. Anyone who has been with a borderline will tell you how she switches. I have vast experience with this. She is at one moment the most loving, caring, empathic, amazing person. She gives you the greatest sex. The most, she's perfect. She's the ideal. And then she thinks you have abandoned her or humiliated her or rejected her. I don't know what goes through her mind. And she switches. And afterwards, she's a psychopath. Secondary psychopath, mind you, but a psychopath.
Yes.
She acts out. She's crazy. She's aggressive. She's violent. I'm saying she, by the way. It's wrong of me because 50% of BPD diagnoses today are actually male.
Everybody listen to that, please. I am sick to death of saying it. Listen to Professor Sam Vaknin. He is a professor, 50% male. Thank you.
Yeah, today, 50% of narcissism diagnoses are female.
Yep.
And 50% of BPD diagnoses are male. Absolutely.
Sam reads the literature, and you probably don't.
It's also reflected. It's reflected in the DSM-5, where the DSM-5 says that corrected the DSM-4. In the DSM-4, it said that 75% of NPD diagnosis were male, and the DSM-5 says 50 to 75%.
Oh, okay.
And the DSM-5 is, of course, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So by now, it's 50-50.
Yeah.
So that was my first contribution, to provide the mechanism and to get rid of comorbidity.
Sorry, Sam, just a small point there. And you're not saying, and nobody's saying, oh, this is because gender roles have changed. You're saying this is, I don't know what you're saying, actually. The diagnostic criteria has improved, right? Men haven't changed to become more borderline.
Diagnostic criteria have largely remained the same. The DSM-5 chickened out and refused to actually, although it does provide alternative models. So the alternative model of narcissism is on page 767. Those of you who want to read the alternative model. But the official model is still borrowed lock, stock, and barrel from DSM-4, which was written in 2000, 22 years ago. That's the state of psychology in the United States, by the way. In the United States, not the rest of the world. The rest of the world advanced.
Yeah.
So, no, I happen to think that gender roles have changed and that women are emulating men. And my thinking is not speculative, nor is it based on personal prejudices, misogynist as I am. It's based on studies that have shown that women describe themselves 8 times more in masculine terms than they used to in 1990. So today, women would use adjectives which used to be totally masculine adjectives. And 8 out of 9 adjectives that women would use would be traditional masculine adjectives. So women have become men, psychologically speaking. This is not pejorative. I'm not criticizing. I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying it's bad. It's a fact, and it's not my fact. The clinical term is told revolution. You can read Lisa Wade's work and other. So it's a fact that women have become much more masculinized. So it's a question of power structure and economic power. They are now men, and so they had acquired men behaviors, men traits, and men pathologies, which goes to show that psychology is not a science, because pathologies are culture-bound. They're context-dependent. Society, culture, the period in history, mores, myths, they all play a role in the emergence and disappearance of pathologies. So women are becoming more narcissistic, and by the way, more psychopathic, dramatically more, like 5 times more narcissistic and about 3 times more psychopathic, overtaking men, because they're becoming men, simply, in every other way, they're becoming men. Their sexual behavior, for example, has changed very dramatically. The problem with women is they have emulated the wrong role model. They've imitated psychopathic men, narcissistic men. And mind you, there are good men around. Not all of us are psychopathic and narcissistic, just the 2 of us. Okay. So this is as an aside. Yes, I think it has to do with changing self-perception. Not so much gender role, but self-perception. Women perceive themselves as masculine. Yeah, definitely. If you've been to Scandinavia, you know what I mean. No,
I live there. Yes, I do know what you mean.
Yes. Okay, so the mechanism was the first contribution. The next contribution was why? What decides? What is the decision-making procedure on which self-state will take over? I mean, I've described how it happens. There is a collapse, notification, this, that. But who decides? Is there a central decision maker? Are they jostling for it? Are they, what's the decision-making process? So I suggested that the choice of self-state, the selection of self-state, is reactive to environmental cues, not endogenous. It doesn't happen from inside. It is provoked from the outside. Now this, many of the viewers won't even realize that how revolutionary this is. A major change in orientation. I don't want to use the word revolution too much, but a major change in orientation.
Yeah.
Psychology used to believe that most processes are endogenous, come from inside.
Yeah.
And so I'm suggesting that actually most processes come from outside, if not all.
Right.
Very close to all. Are reactive to cues and to needs, unmet needs that the environment doesn't satisfy. So everything is environmental.
Yes.
So this was the second contribution. You want to say something for a change?
I was just going to say the movement away from the endogenous to an exogenous, which means either from the inside or from the outside, sounds like a healthy move away from the medicalization of the subject.
Yes. And also, I think provides a more realistic picture.
Yes.
Because we have this grandiose self-delusion that we are in control. There's a need, this hallowing, this glorification of an internal locus of control.
Yes, yeah.
Awaken the giant inside you.
Yeah.
If you just put your mind to it, there's nothing you cannot do. These Tony Robbins messages, they are forms of magical thinking.
Yeah.
This is pathological.
Yeah.
We are mostly reactive to the outside. And most of these reactions are totally unconscious. 95% of all the information we get from the environment is unconscious. We don't process it consciously.
Yeah.
Yet we are reactive to all of it.
Yes.
So, and the environment decides who we are at any given moment and how we change at any given moment. So this is very difficult to digest.
Yeah.
People want to feel that they're in charge, they're the boss, they're on top, they are, in control. They're not.
Yeah.
We are creatures of our environment. So the self states are reactive to environmental cue. For example, you have a need. I'm a narcissist. I have a need for supply. You have a need. You're borderline. You have a need to be regulated from the outside by your intimate partner. You have a need for external regulation. I don't know. You're a psychopath. You have a need to gratify yourself. Your self-gratification. You need to obtain your goals. You're a normal person. You have a need for intimacy and love. I mean, we all have needs. If the environment frustrates you repeatedly, there comes a point that your unmet needs become a trauma.
Yeah.
It's, by the way, an excellent definition of a trauma. A trauma is when your needs are unmet profoundly. The child needs to feel safe. If the child is sexually violated, this need is not met, and it creates trauma. So when the environment is exceedingly frustrating, exceedingly aggressive, exceedingly denying, in such an environment, your needs are not met. If this continues for very long or very deeply, you're traumatized. And you use a self-state capable of coping with the exigencies and parameters of that specific environment. The environment decides who you are at any given moment. Now, it stands to reason, because I just said a few minutes ago, I said that the transition is mediated via collapse.
Yeah.
When your personality disorder doesn't provide you with a solution, when you collapse, you adopt another personality disorder. But what does it mean to collapse? It means that the environment denied you what you needed, what you wanted. When the narcissist collapses, it means he cannot get supply.
Yes.
Where do you get supply from? From the outside.
Yeah. Yeah.
When the borderline collapses, it means that she had been abandoned or rejected. Where did this come from? From the outside. The intimate partner abandoned and rejected her. Collapse comes from the outside, never from the inside. So if collapse is the trigger for transition from one self-state to another, it means that it's environmental, because collapse is only from the outside. So this is my second contribution. And then when I was released from mental asylum after stating the first two contributions, I came up with another two, because the mental asylum was nice and they had bubble gum.
More blood. Delicious.
This is the blood of Dalmatian virgins. The best. The best.
You must share your source with me.
The source is no longer with us. Richard, I'm going to ask something, but please don't take it badly or wrongly.
Yeah.
Do you follow me? Because if you don't follow me, no one else will.
I do, but I am. The RAM space is working. It's working at overdrive.
No, these are not easy. These are not easy.
It's hard. It's hard.
I mean, if you watch the McGill presentation, all the heads of faculties of McGill were there. I mean, McGill is one of the 5 most important universities when it comes to psychology, and they had difficulties.
Yeah,
it's on the video. I mean, they say, I don't understand. Can you explain? I don't. So no offense, and it's nothing personal. This is simply extremely difficult material.
Yeah, no, I think I do follow. I think I am following. And so far you've given me the first 2. It makes a lot more sense to me and seems like a much more robust and functional model. And it accounts for so much of the dross. It's so easy to get bogged down in the therapeutic process if you hang on to this thick, drossy way of looking at things. But if you insist that it's internal, if you insist that that it's childhood trauma, if you insist on a singularity state, oh God, it's a pain in the arse getting anything done. So this is a much better model.
And you're mistreating your patient. Because
Absolutely.
If you don't have a single self, you failed. Something's wrong with you. You pathologize your patient and you're setting up your patient for failure.
Yes. Yeah.
Because the patient is not a single self; it's multiple selves.
Yes.
And then, you have multiple selves. You should be in a mental asylum. No, you're setting the patient up for failure. And then you say, okay, the aim of the therapeutic process is for you to feel unitary, to have a clear hierarchy, and the patient is incapable of that because it's a counterfactual representation of reality. It's not real. It's nonsense.
You're asking the human to behave as a giraffe. I mean, it's just not the natural shape of a human being.
Right, and then the person says, "What's wrong with me? I cannot be a giraffe. What's wrong with me, basically?"
Yeah.
No?
You would always
terrible
make a terrible giraffe.
Yeah. So the next question I asked myself: what happens if there is an environment where 2 self states are equally efficient, equally efficacious? Like if you have an environment where one self state is efficacious and the others are not, it's easy. That self state will take over, come forward, and so resolve the issue. What do you do when you have an environment which is fuzzy, where multiple self states can obtain the same self-efficacious outcome? Then I developed something called the binary system. Binary system means that you can have simultaneously 2 or more self-states if they share something in common. Not, for example, borderline and psychopath. Borderline and psychopath are the opposites of each other. I have no idea how could anyone be diagnosed with borderline and psychopath simultaneously, which is, by the way, 30% of diagnosis today.
Really?
This is so... I mean, if you diagnose someone with borderline and psychopathy at the same time, you have no idea about borderline and no idea about psychopathy. I mean, you're ignorant. Okay.
Yeah.
But for example, covert and overt narcissists can coexist. Why? Because they have a lot in common. They have so much in common that some aspects of the covert combined with some aspects of the overt can be better suited for the environment. So I came up with binary systems. And I suggested, for example, new diagnosis based on this, like covert borderline, which is taking off, by the way. Covert borderline is a diagnosis that's taking off. Covert borderline is actually a combination of some elements of borderline with some elements of narcissism. Covert narcissism, in effect. So this, I call it the residual states condition, where you have 2 self-states collaborating in managing the environment. And this creates, for example, in narcissism, it creates self-supply. If you have, for example, imagine a narcissist cannot obtain supply. Just does everything he tries to be cerebral, he tries to be somatic, but he fails to obtain supply. So there is collapse. There's mortification, And theoretically, he should transition to another mental health disorder. He should become a borderline. He should become a psychopath. I don't know. But imagine that the environment says, I'm not giving you supply, but if you were to change just a bit, I'm going to give you supply. So this creates a binary system. The narcissist becomes overt and covert. The environment at this stage is denying. So the binary system generates the supply internally. The covert basks in the glory of the overt, and the overt uses the covert, feels superior over the covert. So it's like totally internalized system where the overt derives supply from the covert, and the covert derives supply from the overt, and they don't need anyone in the environment. It's a self-contained system. Same with borderline. A borderline loses her intimate partner. She collapses. The next transition usually is to psychopathy, factor 2 psychopathy, or narcissism. A psychopath fails to gratify himself. He becomes a narcissist, a grandiose narcissist. These are the transitions. But if there's enough fuzziness in the environment, maybes, if there are maybes in the air, some of these self-states will remain stuck together in an attempt to compensate somehow. And when this happens, all the needs are met internally. The person disconnects from the environment because the environment is injurious, is wounding, is painful, and the person starts to supply internally. The narcissist starts to supply himself with supply. It's called self-supply. The borderline creates an imaginary intimate partner inside her head. You ask any borderline, she calls it special friend. So she creates an imaginary intimate partner. The psychopath will gratify himself by deceptions, self-deception, or some lies that he tells himself. So they will all become schizoid. They will disconnect from the environment and provide their own needs. So the binary system was a contribution that I made. And the last contribution is that I suggested that all people have a psychopathic self-state. All, healthy and not healthy. They all have a psychopathic self-state, which is essentially a protective self-state. Now, I borrowed this from internal family system. In internal family system, you have this, a protector, and so. Yeah. But I just said the protector is a psychopath. Yes. It's not just a protector; it's a psychopath. It's a psychopathic self-state. So, when the narcissist is narcissistically injured or mortified, there's a protective psychopathic self-state. Same with the borderline. And this psychopathic self-state, the role of this self-state is to prevent emotional pain and hurt, pain aversion, hurt aversion. And it does this using various mechanisms like emotional numbing, reduced affect display, schizoid behavior, aggression, externalized aggression, and so on. If the psychopathic self-state fails to protect, everything is internalized. So the aggression is internalized and become depression. That's not my observation. That is observation by someone called Herbert Rosenfeld. And so the source of mood disorders like depression in personality disordered people is a failure of the psychopathic protective state. As long as the psychopathic protective state works well, you are not likely as a cluster B to disintegrate, to decompensate, to feel depressed. But when your psychopathic self-state fails, then everything the psychopathic self-state was assigned to do to the environment, it's going to do to you. It becomes internalized because of the binary system concept. To summarize this, if you fail with the environment, you go in. If you fail out, you go in. Whatever you wanted to do in the environment, you do to yourself. Whatever you wanted to accomplish, you try to accomplish internally. Supply, self-supply. No intimate partner, imaginary partner. I mean, whatever you become solipsistic cosmos, where all the processes, all the needs are met, but also all the emotions and the dynamics are self-directed, including very destructive dynamics. Because the psychopathic protective self-state is out to destroy other people. It's out to protect you. It's, to punch anyone who tries to hurt you. But if it fails, it will punch you. That is the core of the self-destructiveness in cluster B personality disorders. It's a lot to digest. All of this is very new and, reverses decades of thinking on this.
Well, if this was used, I'd be very. Have you started doing therapy with clients using this model?
Yes, I'm using this. I've been using it for years, for 3 years, 4 years.
It'll be
to great effect.
And do you find this to be a more effective model than
it's much more realistic. I don't know about effective. Come on, no one has a unitary self. It's nonsense. I mean, just look at people. People will tell you, I'm not the same as I used to be a year ago.
Yeah.
No one is a unitary self. There's no such thing as just a borderline. Every borderline has psychopathic phases, narcissistic phases.
Yes.
My model is much, much, much closer to reality. I don't know if it's intellectually superior. I don't know if it's more efficacious, but it's much closer to reality. Much closer. I'm trying to implement it in my work, I think to good effect. But I would be happy if someone who is more clinically oriented, like treatment oriented, would take it and run with it and develop some therapies based on it or whatever. But one thing I can say for sure, I am a hell of a lot closer to how people really are than all the nonsense currently taught in universities about in psychology.
Oh yeah.
I'm using the word nonsense judiciously.
Yeah,
it's counterfactual.
I agree with you. And I think I think an awareness is dawning that just because a university lecturer or a professor says it, or just because it's in a psychology textbook, that doesn't make it gospel. I mean, these things are still very, very open to interpretation and
very fluid. Yeah.
As you started out by saying, these things are bound in a culture, and then they're reinterpreted through our culture. We don't live in 1901 in Austria, but we take the 1901 Austria worldview, put it into 1945 conservative America, and then spew. You can't. I think we started this conversation by saying, in a sense, science as humans doing science, we can't get away from the fact that we're humans observing other humans, and in a sense, that means we're humans observing ourselves. And that's a problem. That's really a problem. Like, the system can't view itself effectively. It seems to be almost like a rule that we have to operate from.
I agree. That's why introspection is very problematic. That's why we go to therapy.
Yes.
It's introspection. I mean, why do I want to talk to you after this podcast? Why do I want to torture you? I mean, ostensibly, I'm well equipped. I know psychology well. I teach psychology. I mean, it's kind of, I don't need you. Why do I need you?
Yes.
I need you because introspection doesn't work. It's a flawed process.
Yes.
And you're right. When psychologists analyze other people and study other people, it's a bit of an introspective process, because the psychologists are also human.
Yes.
Some of them are also human.
Yeah.
So it's a human watching a human. It's very flawed. By definition, it's very flawed.
I'd like to come back to this topic with you again. I need to think about what we've just been through. I need to get therapy myself for what I've just been through.
Goes without saying. This is a serious trauma, this interview.
Would you be open to having some more conversations about this? Because I find this fascinating.
I absolutely don't want to ever see you again. Don't call me. Don't.
Okay. Well, good. I see this as a challenge. I will start stalking you.
Of course I would. Yeah, with pleasure. No problem.
Lovely. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. Hopefully we'll be speaking to Sam again soon, and we can get some more insights. Thank you again, Sam, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers.
Thank you.